The night the screens started dying, the first warning wasn't an alarm. It was a pause. At 9:17 p.m., inside the operations control room of Harbor Point Shipping Terminal, a young logistics coordinator named Elena Ruiz frowned at one of the cargo tracking screens. For a brief second, a container icon froze in place. Then it moved again. She almost ignored it. The terminal stretched across hundreds of acres along the coastline. Delays happened. Software glitches happened. Equipment failed every day. But 30 seconds later, another screen hesitated. Then another. Across the room, operators exchanged uncertain looks. Outside, under a sky heavy with low clouds, giant ship-to-shore cranes stood over rows of stacked containers. Floodlights cast long reflections across wet concrete. A steady wind rolled in from the ocean, carrying the smell of salt, diesel fuel, and rain. The night shift was supposed to be routine. It wasn't. By 9:26, automated container routing began malfunctioning. By 9:31, loading schedules started disappearing from operator terminals. At 9:38, 3 autonomous cargo vehicles stopped moving entirely. Nobody panicked yet, not openly. The terminal handled billions of dollars in freight every year. It had backup systems, emergency procedures, consultants on speed dial. Problems were expected. What worried people was how strange this one felt. Every attempted correction seemed to create another problem somewhere else. A server reboot restored one section of the network, but knocked another offline. A power reset fixed several cargo scanners, but disabled 2 loading cranes. Nothing behaved normally. Inside the maintenance building nearly half a mile away, Frank Mercer was finishing paperwork. The fluorescent lights above his desk buzzed softly. His coffee had gone cold hours earlier. He was reviewing inspection notes from a transformer station when a radio transmission crackled through the speaker mounted near the wall. Control room requesting electrical support. Frank looked up. He waited. More voices followed. Urgent, confused, overlapping. He listened for nearly a minute before standing. Most technicians would have rushed. Frank didn't. He placed his pen carefully on the desk, folded the paperwork, and slipped it into a drawer. Then he grabbed his weathered tool bag. The bag looked older than some of the employees working at the terminal. So did Frank. At 58, his dark hair had long ago surrendered to gray. Deep lines marked the corners of his eyes. Years of climbing ladders, crawling through utility spaces, and working long shifts had left their mark on his shoulders and hands. He moved slowly, not because he was weak, because he had learned that rushing often caused people to miss things. Outside, the wind had strengthened. Rain mist drifted through the floodlights. As Frank crossed the maintenance yard, he could already hear distant warning tones echoing from the terminal. Not emergency alarms, system alerts. Dozens of them. That wasn't normal. When he entered the operations building, the atmosphere felt different immediately. People weren't speaking the way they usually did. Their voices carried an edge, the kind that appears when nobody fully understands what's happening. Large digital displays covered the walls. Several flashed warning messages. Others showed frozen data streams. Managers stood behind operators. Engineers crowded around terminals. Phones rang constantly. Frank remained near the back of the room. Nobody noticed him arrive. That wasn't unusual. He spent most of his career being overlooked. A young systems engineer pointed toward a network diagram. "We've isolated the issue twice." Another shook his head. "No, you isolated a symptom." A third person interrupted. "Then why did 3 more zones go offline?" Nobody had an answer. Frank watched quietly. For several minutes, he said nothing. Then something caught his attention. Not a screen, not a report, a sound, faint, almost hidden beneath the noise of conversations and equipment. His eyes shifted toward a maintenance monitor, displaying electrical load information. One transformer station showed a pattern that felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just wrong enough. Frank stepped closer. The numbers fluctuated slightly. Most people wouldn't have noticed. He did. Years ago, he had learned something that couldn't be taught in manuals. Electrical systems developed personalities. Healthy systems behaved predictably. Unhealthy ones whispered before they screamed. This one was whispering. A supervisor finally noticed him. "Frank." Frank nodded. "What have you got?" The supervisor rubbed his forehead. "We don't know." That answer concerned Frank more than any alarm, because the people in this room usually knew. He studied the electrical data again, then looked toward the dark windows overlooking the terminal. Far in the distance, Beyond rows of containers and loading equipment sat an older section of infrastructure near the waterfront. Most employees rarely thought about it. Many didn't even know it existed. The equipment there had been partially replaced years ago. Partially, not completely. Frank remembered every piece because he had helped install some of it. A strange feeling settled into his chest. Not fear, recognition. Like hearing the first notes of a song you hadn't heard in decades. The supervisor noticed his expression. "What is it?" Frank didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked once more at the electrical patterns, then toward the waterfront, then back again. The same irregular pulse, again and again. Small, consistent, unnatural. Outside, a cargo crane suddenly stopped moving. The entire control room turned toward the monitor displaying its status. Another alert appeared, then another. The problems were spreading. Whatever had started this wasn't finished. Frank picked up a maintenance radio from the nearest desk. The supervisor watched him. "You see something?" Frank adjusted the radio frequency. "Maybe." The supervisor waited. "What kind of maybe?" Frank looked through the glass toward the distant darkness beyond the terminal lights, toward a part of the facility most people had forgotten, toward machinery that had been humming long before many current employees were born. A place connected to old blueprints, old decisions, old mistakes, and suddenly, for reasons he couldn't fully explain yet, he felt certain the answers weren't in the control room. They were somewhere out there, hidden beneath years of upgrades and assumptions. The supervisor followed his gaze. "What are you looking at?" For a moment, Frank said nothing. The wind rattled the windows. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Then he finally spoke. "I need access to the old waterfront power section." The supervisor frowned. "Nobody's been in there for years." Frank nodded. "I know." "Why?" Frank stared into the darkness beyond the floodlights, a darkness that suddenly felt much closer than it should. When he finally answered, his voice was calm. "Because I think the problem started long before tonight." The forgotten blueprint. The old waterfront power section sat at the far edge of Harbor Point Terminal, hidden behind rows of unused storage containers and a rusting chain-link fence that most employees passed without noticing. By 10:24 p.m., rain was falling steadily. Frank Mercer stood beneath a flickering security light while a maintenance supervisor searched for keys that hadn't been used in years. The steel access gate groaned as it opened. Dust drifted from the hinges. Behind it stretched a narrow service road leading toward a squat concrete building overlooking the harbor. The structure looked abandoned. It wasn't. At least not completely. "This place still connected?" the supervisor asked. Frank nodded. "Parts of it." The answer didn't seem reassuring. Far offshore, the lights of cargo ships shimmered through the rain. Behind them, dark clouds pressed low against the horizon. The terminal's warning systems continued to echo in the distance. Every few minutes, another radio transmission arrived. More equipment failures, more confusion, more pressure. The estimated losses were climbing by the minute. Yet Frank moved at the same deliberate pace he always had. The supervisor followed him inside. The air smelled of old insulation, machine oil, and concrete dampened by decades of sea air. Flashlight beams swept across aging electrical cabinets. Most carried faded labels from the late 1990s. Frank's eyes lingered on them. Memories surfaced unexpectedly. Not dramatic memories, small ones. Long shifts, coffee in paper cups, laughter from coworkers who had retired years ago. Arguments over wiring plans, blueprints spread across folding tables. A different life, a younger version of himself. Back then, Harbor Point had been expanding rapidly. Everyone wanted faster construction, faster upgrades, faster approvals. Speed meant money. Money meant promotions. Few people wanted delays caused by cautious electricians asking difficult questions. Frank remembered that lesson clearly. He stopped in front of an old transformer enclosure. The familiar low hum filled the room. The same sound that had caught his attention earlier. Now he could hear the problem more clearly. Not with instruments, with experience. The rhythm wasn't stable. A faint oscillation rolled through the system, almost like a heartbeat skipping every few seconds. The supervisor watched him. "You can hear something?" Frank gave a slight nod. "Maybe." The supervisor sighed. "Everybody keeps saying maybe tonight." Frank almost smiled. That's because anyone saying definitely doesn't know what they're talking about. For a moment, the tension eased. Then Frank opened a cabinet panel. His expression changed immediately. Inside, several monitoring indicators showed patterns he hadn't expected, not because they were damaged, because they were still operating. His flashlight moved slowly across the wiring, then stopped. A number, painted decades earlier. His stomach tightened. He knew that number. He had written it himself. The supervisor noticed. "What is it?" Frank didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at the faded marking. 30 years disappeared in an instant. Suddenly, he was 28 again, standing inside a temporary construction trailer, holding a revised blueprint, listening to project managers debate costs. He remembered pointing toward a section of the electrical design, a shortcut, a modification intended to save time. Not dangerous immediately, but risky in the long run. He remembered warning them. He remembered being ignored. Most of all, he remembered walking away. At the time, he told himself it wasn't his decision. He wasn't the engineer. He wasn't management. He was just the electrician. The project moved forward anyway. Life moved forward too. Years passed. The terminal expanded. Systems evolved. People retired. People died. And eventually the memory buried itself beneath decades of routine. Until tonight. Frank opened another panel. The original vulnerability still existed, hidden beneath layers of upgrades, invisible to modern software, ignored because nobody remembered it was there, except him. A radio transmission crackled sharply. Control to maintenance. We just lost 2 more loading sectors. The supervisor cursed under his breath. Frank closed his eyes briefly. The situation was accelerating. The flaw wasn't merely causing failures. It was creating a cascading electrical imbalance moving through interconnected systems. Every attempted software correction was pushing the infrastructure harder, making the damage spread faster. The people in the control room were fighting symptoms. The source remained untouched. "We need the archive room," Frank said. The supervisor looked surprised. "Archive room? There should still be paper blueprints." "Paper?" Frank nodded. "The old system predates half the digital records." 20 minutes later, they were searching through rows of metal filing cabinets in a forgotten records building. Dust coated everything. Rain tapped against narrow windows. The archive clerk on night duty seemed shocked anyone wanted physical documents. Yet eventually they found them. Massive rolled schematics secured with aging rubber bands. Frank carried them to a table, carefully unrolling sheet after sheet. The supervisor watched as Frank traced lines across the drawings. Transformers, feed routes, load balancing networks, expansion modifications. Then suddenly Frank stopped. His finger remained fixed on one location, the missing piece, the flaw, the exact place where the original shortcut connected multiple systems in ways nobody intended. For years it had remained harmless. Now growing electrical demand had finally pushed it beyond its limits. The supervisor stared. "You're telling me this whole thing started here?" Frank nodded. "I think so." "You sure?" Frank looked down at the blueprint. His own handwriting sat in one corner. A warning note. 30 years old. Still visible. Still ignored. A strange mix of regret and responsibility settled over him. He couldn't change what happened back then, but he could stop what was happening now. The supervisor studied the diagram, then looked back at Frank. "What do we do?" For the first time all night, Frank answered immediately. "We shut it down." The supervisor blinked. "The whole section? Everything connected to it. That'll knock out half the terminal. It'll save the other half." The radio crackled again. Another failure, another warning, another piece of the system slipping away. The supervisor stared at the blueprint, then at Frank. Outside, thunder rolled across the harbor. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, the supervisor asked the question both of them were thinking. "If you're wrong?" Frank looked at the maze of lines crossing the blueprint, the decisions of engineers, managers, contractors, and one young electrician who hadn't fought hard enough when it mattered. His voice remained steady. "If I'm wrong, we lose a lot of money." The supervisor swallowed. "And if you're right?" Frank folded the blueprint carefully, then met his eyes. "If I'm right, we've got less than an hour left to save this place." Far across the terminal, another section of lights suddenly went dark, and for the first time that night, the supervisor didn't hesitate. He reached for the radio. "Get me the control room." Frank picked up the blueprint. The longest part of the night was about to begin. 47 minutes. At 2:11 a.m., Harbor Point Shipping Terminal was still alive. Barely. From the windows of the operations center, the sprawling port looked wounded. Entire sections of the facility sat dark beneath the rain. Cargo cranes stood frozen over stacks of containers. Emergency lights blinked along service roads like distant beacons in the mist. Inside the control room, exhaustion had replaced panic. People spoke more quietly now. The shouting had ended hours ago. What remained was uncertainty. And all eyes had gradually shifted toward a man who had spent most of his career avoiding attention. Frank Mercer stood over a conference table covered with blueprints, coffee cups, handwritten notes, electrical load calculations. The room's executives, engineers, and operations managers listened while he explained the shutdown sequence one final time. Not because he sounded confident, because he sounded careful. There was a difference. "We isolate these sectors first," Frank said, tracing a route across the blueprint. "Then we disconnect the secondary feed." A systems engineer frowned. "And after that?" Frank looked at the drawing. "After that, we find out if I'm right." Nobody laughed. The estimated financial impact of a complete shutdown had climbed beyond $90 million. Contracts were at risk. Shipping schedules were collapsing. Clients across multiple countries were already demanding answers. But strangely, none of that seemed to matter to Frank at that moment. He wasn't thinking about money. He was thinking about electricity, about systems, about responsibility, about a warning he had written 30 years earlier, a warning he should have fought harder to defend. The operations director checked his watch. "You still believe 47 minutes is enough?" Frank nodded. "If the damage hasn't reached the secondary network." The director noticed the wording. "If." Frank didn't try to soften the truth. "If." Silence settled briefly over the room. Then the director looked around at everyone gathered there. Nobody had a better option. Finally, he gave a single nod. "Do it." Outside, rain swept across the terminal. The shutdown began. One by one, electrical sectors disconnected. Massive portions of the facility disappeared into darkness. Control room monitors tracked each step. Green indicators turned yellow. Yellow indicators turned red. Operators watched in tense silence. Every stage increased the risk. There would be no easy recovery if something went wrong now. Frank moved between teams continuously, checking readings, verifying connections, reviewing load balances. Years of experience guided him through details no software could interpret, not because he was extraordinary, because he had spent decades paying attention. At 2:29 a.m., the first complication appeared. A technician rushed toward him. "We've got a problem." Frank turned. "What kind?" "The isolation sequence isn't holding." Frank followed him immediately. Minutes later, they stood inside a switching station, illuminated by portable work lights. The air smelled of rainwater and warm metal. The technician pointed toward the monitoring display. Frank studied it, and looked again. Something felt wrong. Not impossible, just unexpected. His stomach tightened. The blueprint had missed something. The original flaw had triggered a secondary failure hidden inside a later expansion project. A failure nobody knew existed, including him. For several seconds, he simply stared. Not because he was afraid, because he was recalculating. 30 years of modifications. Hundreds of upgrades, thousands of electrical connections. The system no longer matched the documents. The blueprint described what the terminal had been, not what it had become. "What do we do?" Frank didn't answer immediately. Outside, thunder rolled across the harbor. Rain tapped against the building's metal roof. The clock continued moving. 47 minutes was becoming less realistic with every passing second. Then, something surfaced in his memory. An expansion project from 14 years earlier. A temporary bypass installed during construction. Most people would never remember it. Frank did, because he had wired it himself. He grabbed a marker, pulled a blank sheet of paper closer, and began sketching. Not from documentation, from memory. The technician watched in disbelief. "You're sure?" Frank shook his head. "No." The technician looked confused. Frank offered a tired smile. "Nobody's sure tonight." Within minutes, crews were moving again. New instructions traveled across radios. Alternative routing paths were established. Additional sectors isolated. The revised sequence began. Slowly, carefully. The control room tracked every change. At 2:57 a.m., the electrical instability stopped spreading. At first, nobody noticed. Then one operator looked up. Wait. Several heads turned. The warning indicators had stopped multiplying. No new failures appeared. For the first time all night, the system wasn't getting worse. Hope entered the room cautiously. Nobody trusted it yet. Frank didn't either. He continued working, checking readings, verifying every connection, looking for signs of another surprise. None appeared. At 3:14 a.m., the restoration process began. The first crane came back online, then another. Cargo scanners reactivated. Routing systems restarted. Loading schedules reappeared on operator screens. One section after another awakened across the terminal. Outside, darkness slowly surrendered to light. Not sunlight, electricity. The familiar glow of a facility returning to life. By 4:02 a.m., Harbor Point was operational. Not perfectly, but safely. The crisis was over. For several moments, nobody spoke. People simply watched the monitors, making sure the numbers remained stable. They did. Finally, scattered applause began somewhere in the back of the control room. It spread slowly, awkwardly, naturally. Frank looked uncomfortable immediately, so he slipped away before anyone could stop him. An hour later, dawn approached. The rain had finally ended. Low clouds drifted across a pale gray sky. Frank walked alone through the terminal. Cargo cranes moved overhead once again. Trucks rolled through loading lanes. Workers returned to their routines. The port sounded alive, as if nothing had happened. That was the strange thing about fixing problems. When done correctly, people quickly forgot how close disaster had been. A week later, executives discussed awards, interviews, and public recognition. Frank attended none of it. He returned to work, just as he always had. But something had changed, not at the terminal. Inside him. One quiet morning, a young apprentice electrician opened an old cabinet during a maintenance inspection. Inside, taped to the metal panel, he discovered a faded note, yellow with age, handwritten, dated 3 decades earlier. It contained a warning about a vulnerability in the electrical system. At the bottom was a signature, Frank Mercer. The apprentice carried the note around for the rest of the day, showing coworkers, reading it again and again. Slowly, people began understanding something. The man they thought was simply part of the maintenance crew had been protecting the facility long before most of them arrived, long before many of them started their careers, long before anyone imagined a $90 million crisis. Late that afternoon, Frank crossed the yard carrying his tool bag. The same worn bag he had carried for years. A crane operator passed by. Then a mechanic. Then 2 dock workers. None of them said much, just small nods, simple gestures, the kind working people understand without words. Frank nodded back. For years he had believed nobody noticed. Maybe that wasn't true. Above him, cranes moved against the brightening sky. Ships entered the harbor. Another ordinary day began. And for the first time in a very long time, Frank smiled. Not because he had saved $90 million, not because anyone finally recognized him, but because he had done something harder. He had finally made peace with the man he used to be. And as the terminal carried on around him, Frank Mercer kept walking toward the next job that needed fixing. What remains after the lights return? 3 weeks after the crisis, Harbor Point looked exactly the way it always had. That was the problem. The cranes moved. The ships arrived. Containers flowed through the terminal. Schedules were back on track. To anyone visiting for the first time, there was no sign that the facility had nearly suffered one of the most expensive operational failures in its history. Life had moved on. Most people were relieved. Frank Mercer wasn't sure how he felt. On a gray Thursday morning, he stood beside a transformer station inspecting a routine maintenance report. The work was ordinary, comfortably ordinary, the kind of work he understood. A young apprentice named Tyler approached carrying a clipboard. He hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Mercer?" Frank looked up. "Yeah?" Tyler shifted awkwardly. "You got a minute?" Frank nodded. The apprentice held up a photocopy. It was the warning note discovered inside the old electrical cabinet, the one Frank had written 30 years earlier. Tyler looked almost embarrassed. "I've been carrying this around." Frank sighed softly. "Why?" The young man shrugged. "I don't know." He studied the paper. "I guess because it keeps bothering me." Frank waited. Tyler continued. "You knew there was a problem. Eventually. And nobody listened." Frank looked back toward the transformer. "Something like that." The apprentice frowned. "Why didn't you keep pushing?" The question landed harder than Tyler realized. For a moment, only the hum of electrical equipment filled the space between them. Frank stared at the concrete, at the oil stains, at the familiar bolts and cables. Things were easier when people asked technical questions. Technical questions had answers. Life questions rarely did. Finally, he spoke. Because I got tired. Tyler blinked. Tired? Frank nodded. Sometimes you fight for something and lose. He paused. Then you fight again and lose. His eyes drifted toward the busy terminal, and after enough years, you convince yourself that keeping your head down is easier. The apprentice didn't answer immediately. The honesty surprised him. Frank noticed. Most younger workers expected older people to have everything figured out. The truth was less impressive. Most people were simply making their way through life the best they could. Mistakes included, regrets included. By lunchtime, Tyler had returned to work, but the conversation lingered in Frank's mind because the apprentice had unknowingly touched something deeper than an old electrical failure. For years, Frank had told himself he stopped caring about recognition. That wasn't completely true. The truth was more complicated. Part of him had stopped believing his voice mattered, and somewhere along the way, that belief had become habit. That evening, after his shift ended, Frank drove home along the coastal highway. Rain clouds drifted over the ocean. The radio remained off. His small house sat on the edge of a quiet neighborhood overlooking the water. Nothing about it was remarkable. A modest place, worn but cared for. The kind of home built through decades of ordinary paychecks. Inside, silence greeted him. It always did. His wife, Laura, had been gone for nearly 12 years. Sometimes that fact felt impossible. Other times, it felt like yesterday. Grief changed shape with time. It never truly disappeared. It simply learned how to sit quietly in the corner. Frank made coffee, then wandered into a spare room he rarely entered. Old boxes filled the closet. Photographs, documents, pieces of a life accumulated over decades. One box contained notebooks from his early years at Harbor Point. Curious, he opened one. Yellowed pages revealed sketches, calculations, observations, ideas. The handwriting belonged to a younger man, a man full of certainty, a man who believed good work would always speak for itself. Frank smiled faintly, then stopped on a particular page. A note written nearly 30 years earlier. One sentence, simple, direct. Systems fail slowly before they fail all at once. He stared at it. The words weren't really about electricity. Not entirely. Relationships work that way too. Careers, communities, people. Small ignored problems eventually became large, unavoidable ones. Maybe that was the lesson the terminal had nearly learned too late. The next morning brought an unexpected surprise. The operations director arrived at the maintenance building, personally. That alone caused confusion. Executives rarely visited maintenance unless something was broken. Frank was replacing a circuit breaker when the director approached. "You got a minute?" Frank set down his tools. "Sure." The director held a folder. "We're starting a review board." Frank immediately looked suspicious. The director laughed. "Nothing bad." "Then why does it involve me?" "Because you know things nobody else knows." Frank frowned. "I fix equipment." "You understand this facility." The director paused. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then the director handed him the folder. Inside were plans for infrastructure upgrades, safety improvements, long-term modernization projects, real projects, important projects. The kind of discussions Frank had spent years excluded from. "I want you involved." Frank looked up. The director continued, "Not because of what happened that night." He glanced toward the terminal. "Because you should have been involved years ago." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Not because they erased the past. They didn't. Nothing could. But they acknowledged it. And sometimes acknowledgement mattered more than apology. Weeks later, Harbor Point continued changing. New inspections were introduced. Old systems were reviewed. Younger workers sought advice from veterans more often. Conversations happened that previously wouldn't have. The terminal became stronger, not because one electrician saved it, but because people finally started listening to each other. One evening near sunset, Tyler found Frank standing beside the waterfront, the same waterfront where the crisis had begun. The harbor glowed orange beneath the fading light. Ships moved slowly toward the horizon. "You ever think about retiring?" Tyler asked. Frank chuckled. "Every Monday." The apprentice laughed, then grew serious. "You know, people talk about that night all the time." Frank looked toward the water. "They'll stop." "Maybe," Tyler smiled, "but they'll remember." For a long moment, neither spoke. The ocean breeze rolled across the harbor. Cranes moved in the distance. The terminal hummed with life. Steady, reliable, ordinary, exactly as it should. And standing there, watching another shift unfold, Frank realized something. A legacy wasn't built in one night. Not even a night that saved $90 million. A legacy was built through thousands of unnoticed days, thousands of repairs, thousands of decisions, thousands of moments when nobody was watching. The crisis had simply revealed what had been there all along, the quiet value of a man who never stopped caring.